I didn't flinch when the HOA president slammed her fist against the table and hissed about trespassing. Her lawyer shuffled his papers, trying to look braver than he was, but his face betrayed him before I ever said a word. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply slid a leather binder across the polished oak and let the weight of a century speak for me. Inside, resting against protective sleeves that smelled faintly of old paper and ink, was the original trust document my grandfather had recorded, one that legally froze the parcel they were claiming as their own, inside a historic protection clause. Their eyes moved from the neat, notarized pages to my calm stare. For the first time in months, they stopped talking. The room, for once, belonged to me. The irony was thick enough to taste. After months of letters, fines, and shouted accusations, all it took was silence and a single document to drain every ounce of their authority. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to threaten. All I had to do was let them realize slowly, painfully, that the little shed they'd tried to seize sat on ground they never had a right to touch. Not then, not now, not ever. The same ground that my grandfather had tucked into a historic trust decades ago, when most of these board members weren't even alive. The shed was just a shed to me, wood, nails, a roof barely worth painting. But to them, it was the excuse they thought they needed to flex power, to make me bend. They had no idea it was sitting on land that outranked their entire HOA charter. I remember watching the president's lip curl, as if she might argue anyway, as if sheer stubbornness could erase the legal chain of title that stretched back farther than her subdivision's founding. But then her lawyer leaned in, eyes darting between the embossed county seal and my steady expression, and shook his head. That was the moment it ended. Not with a bang, not with a shouting match, but with the quiet collapse of their certainty. What they didn't realize in that instant was just how long I had been waiting for it. The sleepless nights, the months of restraint, the careful gathering of every scrap of evidence, had been building toward this scene since the day they first tried to strip me of my rights. And now, sitting in that too-bright meeting room with a dozen neighbors pretending not to stare, I let myself breathe in the victory, but to understand how I got there, to understand why an aging piece of paper signed by my grandfather was enough to topple their crusade, you have to rewind. You have to know what kind of life I was trying to build before the AO ever decided I was their target. You have to know how peaceful it was, and how easily they shattered it. The strange thing about power is how quickly it evaporates when someone realizes they never had it to begin with. I watched it happen across that conference table like a slow-motion collapse. Their voices, once sharp and self-assured, drained into awkward silence the moment the county seal glared back at them from my binder. The HOA president, a woman who had spent months posturing as if she owned every square foot of this neighborhood, sat back in her chair and blinked. Her confidence didn't just falter, it withered. It's funny, the things your mind chooses to notice in moments like that. For me, it wasn't her expression. It wasn't even the lawyer, who suddenly seemed far too interested in the stitching along the spine of his folder. No, what I noticed was the fluorescent light above us, buzzing faintly as if it too was straining to keep composure. It flickered once, just once, like it was holding back a laugh. I could have spoken then. I could have driven the knife deeper with a few well-chosen words. But I didn't. I leaned back in my chair, let the leather creak, and said nothing. Silence, I'd learned, was sharper than any retort. And silence was exactly what I'd been denied for months. Silence in my home, silence in my yard, silence in my life. Now it was theirs to sit in. The irony wasn't lost on me. The shed they claimed had violated aesthetic harmony wasn't even impressive. It was small, patched together with stubborn practicality rather than beauty, the kind of structure meant to serve rather than impress. I built it for storage, a place to keep my tools dry while I worked on the cabin. Nothing more. But to the HOA, it became a symbol, a flag they planted in their petty war against me. And like most tyrants, they mistook persistence for legitimacy. I had let them escalate, let them circle, let them think they were winning. There's a certain power in restraint, though it doesn't feel like it when you're living it. When you're the one collecting notices from your mailbox, Reading fine after fine, watching your neighbors cross the street rather than wave restraint feels like weakness. But restraint is also patience. And patience, when armed with law, is lethal. The lawyer cleared his throat. His fingers drummed lightly against the table, and he looked at me as if hoping I'd offer him a way out. I didn't. He opened his mouth once, then shut it again, the words dying before they found air. Somewhere to my left, a board member shuffled nervously in her seat, her stack of violation photos suddenly looking childish angles of my shed taken from across hedges, from the sidewalk, even from the street. Grainy, zoomed in, shots meant to shame. Now, reduced to trivia against the weight of a notarized trust. It was almost too easy. I thought about my grandfather then, not in a sentimental way, but with a kind of grim amusement. He was a man who believed in paperwork the way some men believe in scripture. He never threw away a receipt, never filed anything without a witness, never signed a page without a second copy tucked away in a fireproof box. When I was young, I thought it was paranoia. I used to tease him about drowning in paper. But sitting there in that room, watching an entire board choke on his foresight, I could almost hear him chuckle. The old man had outlived them without lifting a finger. The HOA president tried again. Her voice cracked on the word jurisdiction, a word she'd flung at me so many times in her letters. It didn't have the same bite now. Her authority was a mask, and masks only work when the audience agrees to play along. I'd stopped playing months ago. Still, I let her speak. I let her falter through half a sentence before I calmly turned the page, letting the crisp sound of paper slice the air. The county clerk's signature stared up at her, bold and undeniable. She closed her mouth. I can't describe the satisfaction of that moment in numbers or terms. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, surgical, final. Like the closing of a heavy door. And yet, as final as it felt, I knew it was only the beginning. Because what they didn't know not yet was that the trust wasn't the only weapon I had uncovered. There were layers to this land, layers they hadn't bothered to research, layers that tied into zoning codes, historic preservation statutes, and even obscure environmental protections. The shed was their excuse, but the land itself was my shield. They thought they had me cornered. They had no idea. I'd been building a fortress out of old paper and ink. I could see the sweat gathering on the lawyer's temple, though he tried to disguise it by adjusting his tie. I didn't envy him. He was the only one in that room who fully understood what the document meant the instant he read it. The board members could pretend, at least for a few minutes, that maybe there was some technicality, some overlooked clause in their charter that still gave them leverage. But the lawyer knew better. He knew that what I had dropped on the table wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a chain of custody, a legal wall that stretched back decades, unbroken and absolute. I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. I didn't rush. I didn't try to explain. Let them sweat, I thought. Let them squirm in the same silence they had weaponized against me when I was sending emails, begging for meetings, asking for clarity. For months, they'd ignored me with smug little smirks, letting the silence fill my mailbox with threats instead of answers. Now it was their turn. The president reached for her water glass and knocked it slightly against the table. The sound was small but sharp, a nervous clink that cut across the stale air. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. I caught it. The lawyer caught it. And based on the way one of the younger board members bit her lip, she caught it too. It's remarkable, really, how fragile authority is. They had built theirs on nothing more than repetition, saying the same things often enough, loudly enough that people stopped questioning them. But the second something real appeared, an actual legal boundary, not just their invented rules, the whole structure shook. And I wasn't even finished, because tucked behind that binder, resting quietly in my bag like a sleeping weapon, was the research I hadn't shown them yet. Copies of county maps, zoning ordinances, environmental surveys. Proof that the land beneath my shed was part of a larger designation my grandfather had maneuvered into protection status long before any of them had written their first violation notice. The trust was the headline. The rest was the body of the article, and trust me, it was a long read. One of the board members cleared his throat and asked, half-hearted question about whether the trust still applied under modern subdivision law. He tried to sound confident, but it came out like a student bluffing through an exam. I didn't even answer. I simply tapped the page where the county's own language confirmed, in black and white, that the trust superseded HOA governance. He swallowed, nodded, and leaned back. That was the end of his contribution. I glanced around the room then, not to gloat, but to take in the faces that had haunted my quiet evenings for months. These were the people who had signed their names to every letter, who had voted to fine me week after week, who had stood in front of neighbors and painted me as reckless, defiant, uncooperative. And now, they looked like children caught stealing cookies. The difference was, children don't usually threaten lawsuits when they're wronged. It was tempting, so tempting to lecture them, to lay out every wrong they had committed, to list the hours they'd stolen from me with their pettiness. But I didn't. That was never the point. The point was to stop them, cleanly and permanently. And the only way to do that was to let the weight of the law do the talking. The lawyer finally spoke, his voice low, almost apologetic. He muttered something about needing time to review the documents. I could have pressed him right there. Demanded he admit in front of everyone that the HOA had overstepped its authority, that they'd built their case on sand. But again, silence was stronger. I simply slid the binder back toward me, closed it, and placed it neatly in my bag. The message was clear. I didn't need their recognition. I didn't need their permission. I had already won. The meeting limped on after that, though everyone knew it was over. They stumbled through agenda items, garden maintenance, trash collection, petty squabbles about paint colors, but their voices were hollow, their authority gutted. I stayed, silent and patient, just long enough to make sure they all saw me calm, composed, and utterly unbothered. Then I left, walking out of that fluorescent-lit room into the cool evening air. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not joy, not triumph, just peace. It's a quieter emotion than most people imagine. It doesn't roar. It doesn't dance. It settles into your chest like a long breath finally released, and yet, even in that moment of calm, I knew the story wasn't finished. The shed was just the surface. The land beneath it carried history, memory, and bloodlines. My grandfather's foresight had given me more than property. It had given me a shield, and if I chose, a sword. But that part of the story, the part that made the HOA's collapse inevitable, started long before that meeting. It started with me, years earlier, when all I wanted was a quiet place to live out my days. As I stepped outside that evening, the sound of the heavy door closing behind me was louder than anything that had been said inside. It echoed down the concrete walkway, bounced off the cars lined neatly in the lot, and for me it sounded like closure. For months, every meeting had felt like walking into an ambush, a stage where they controlled the script and I was cast as the villain. But not this time. This time, I had brought my own script, one written long before most of them were born. I paused at my truck and looked back at the community center windows. The blinds were tilted, but I could see the shadows of figures moving inside. They hadn't adjourned yet. No doubt the board was still whispering, scrambling to recover, to reframe what had just happened. But recovery wasn't possible. You can't rewrite a century-old trust with whispers. You can't erase ink that's been pressed into official ledgers for generations. They were finished, and they knew it. The air was cool, and I could smell cut grass from the soccer field across the lot. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel watched. That may sound small, but it isn't. Living under an HOA's thumb has a way of making you hyper-aware, like you're always on stage, always being measured. Every tool left out for too long, every guest car parked at the curb, every repair made without their approval becomes a performance to be judged. That night, for the first time, I felt invisible again, and invisibility was freedom. Driving home, I thought about how absurd it all was. A shed, that's what it had boiled down to. They could have ignored it. They could have let me fix up my grandfather's old place in peace. Instead, they latched onto that shed like it was a threat to civilization. They wrote letters, fined me, threatened court. And for what? To prove they could. That's what it always was about. Not the rules, not the aesthetics, not community harmony. Power, the cheap kind of power that comes from pushing someone you think won't push back. I almost laughed thinking about it. Because if they had known, if they had done even a day's worth of research, they would have realized they picked the wrong target. Not because I'm some legal genius, not because I had money to throw at lawyers, but because of one simple fact: the ground they were trying to control didn't belong to them in any universe. It had been tied up and locked down by my grandfather, who understood the value of foresight in ways the HOA president couldn't dream of. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd settled into a kind of quiet satisfaction. The shed sat there in the fading light, squat and unimpressive, like it had been all along. I put the truck in park and just stared at it for a while. To anyone else, it was just a structure. To me, it had become a battleground and a monument to stubbornness. Mine and theirs alike. I should have been exhausted, but I wasn't. I should have felt triumphant, but that wasn't it either. What I felt was steadiness, like a balance had finally been restored. The board had treated me like a trespasser on my own land. Tonight, they learned I was the one person in the entire subdivision who could never be removed, no matter how many votes they held. That kind of truth settles into you deeper than celebration. Inside, I dropped my bag by the door and poured myself a glass of water. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of old floorboards. I sat at the kitchen table, sipped slowly, and let the silence wash over me. For months, silence had been suffocating, mailbox silent, neighbor silent, meeting silent. But this silence was different. This silence was earned. Still, I couldn't help but think ahead. They wouldn't take this lying down, not really. People like that don't admit defeat, they just retreat and plot. But the beauty of it was, they had no ground left to plot on. The trust didn't just block their current claim. It crippled every future attempt too. It was ironclad, and it wasn't going anywhere. They could posture, they could bluster, they could try to save face, but they could never touch what mattered. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about winning. It was about survival. Not physical survival, but the survival of peace, dignity, and memory. My grandfather hadn't left me a mansion or fortune. He'd left me land he had protected in the only way he knew how. And tonight, that gift proved stronger than all their bylaws combined. I sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet, and for the first time since the letters started showing up in my mailbox, I let myself smile because the war wasn't really about a shed. It was about history colliding with arrogance. And history, in the form of a trust older than their board, had won. When I first came back to my grandfather's land, I wasn't looking for a fight. I wasn't even looking for much of anything, just peace, something quiet enough to let my thoughts settle. Life has a way of grinding noise into you, and after years of chasing jobs, dealing with crowded neighborhoods, and listening to the endless hum of traffic, I wanted stillness. That's all. Just stillness. The parcel wasn't much to anyone else, I suppose. A modest stretch of property, framed by a crooked fence that leaned like an old man resting on his cane, with a cabin that carried more character than comfort. The roof sagged in places, the porch creaked under my weight, and every window pane rattled when the wind blew hard enough. But it was mine, or rather, it was ours. It was the kind of place you inherit not because it's valuable on paper, but because it holds the weight of memory. I can still remember the first night I spent there after moving back. The house smelled faintly of cedar and dust, the kind of scent that makes you both nostalgic and restless. I laid down on the old bed frame, listening to crickets outside and the occasional owl calling from the trees, and I thought, this is it. This is where I'll finally breathe again. No sirens? No neighbors' stereos thumping through thin walls. No endless chatter of people who never stop to let silence do its work. Just me, the cabin, and the woods. Days fell into an easy rhythm. I'd rise with the sun, the light pouring through the east-facing windows, and I'd take my coffee out onto the porch where the boards bowed slightly under my chair. From there, I could see the shed in the corner of the lot, the one that would later become such a ridiculous battleground. Back then, though, it was just storage, a place to keep the mower and some old fishing gear. I'd sip slowly, watching the fog lift from the fields, and let the morning unfold without hurry. The work was steady, but it was the good kind of work. Fixing leaks, repainting siding, clearing brush that had crept too close during years of neglect. It was the sort of labor that left your hands sore but your mind clean. At night I'd sit with a book under the glow of a single lamp, sometimes nodding off to the quiet hum of cicadas. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And in a world that constantly tries to tell you what to want, there's a deep satisfaction in knowing exactly what's enough. Neighbors weren't an issue, at least not at first. A few waved when I moved in, polite but distant. I wasn't looking to insert myself into anyone's lives, so I let the distance stand. I figured we'd get to know each other slowly, maybe share a wave here and there, maybe borrow a tool someday. Nothing more. I didn't need cookouts or block parties. I needed space, and for a while, it seemed like I had it. I'd tell friends from the city about it sometimes, and they'd shake their heads. "Doesn't it get lonely out there?" they'd ask. But the truth is, loneliness and solitude aren't the same thing. Loneliness is when you want company and can't find it. Solitude is when you don't want company and don't need it. What I had was solitude, and it was exactly what I'd been craving. If I had known then what kind of storm was coming, maybe I would have appreciated those early months more. Maybe I would have spent more evenings on the porch listening to the wind rustle the trees. Maybe I would have taken longer walks down the dirt road, memorized the feeling of living without conflict. But you never realize the value of peace until someone tries to take it from you. Looking back, those days were the calm before a storm I didn't see coming, not because it was hidden, but because I couldn't fathom anyone caring enough about my little shed or my patch of land to stir up trouble. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't disruptive. I wasn't trying to stand out. But in a neighborhood run by people addicted to control, simply existing quietly was enough to paint a target on my back. And so, the shed that had once been nothing more than a storage space, a forgotten corner of my property, became the spark that lit months of harassment. But before that, before the letters and the threats and the meetings, there was just peace. A peace so simple it almost feels like a dream now.